I wanted to start first by I don't know if you all had a chance to read the article that Sharon sent. It was from the New York Times. Um, I can't remember what it was called. That basically how to stay centered in these Trumpian times, something along those lines. But it was David Brooks, and David Brooks, interestingly, he's always been more conservative than progressive, but he's certainly starting to fall back on, some Judeo-Christian values that he hasn't always been as, uh, explicit about. But he almost came across as proselytizing, and which is fine. I mean, in pure David Brooks fashion, he did it with the utmost of class. But what I thought it was really interesting about the article is that he defined these times that we're talking about as you know uh, pagan in their characterization. It's always marked by the theme of kind of narcissistic uh, male self-centeredness, which is very aggressive, very violent, with concern not about another, but mostly about oneself, which marked, of course, the Roman Empire, as well as many other empires. And in fact, I can't even imagine an empire without that kind of without that kind of orientation to the world. But he, counterposed that with the idea of, the Christianity and the focus on, the understanding of what it means, the value of what it means to be human and how to look for human connections among others. But what I thought he really pointed out quite well was the way that somehow this new form of Christianity has been placed as a veneer over the top of this something that's ultimately pagan, right? To the point where we're now beginning to interpret the Bible through that pagan lens of narcissism and everything that our current administration seems to stand for. But thank you, Sharon, for sending that. I don't know, did anybody else have a chance to read it? Oh, nice, nice article. Denny, did you get a chance?
When did that come out? I mean, where did it show up on Sharon's?
I think
Sharon?
Sharon sent it on Monday, right,
It
Sharon?
was in the Times. I think that was one of his latest Friday afternoon columns.
Yeah, yeah,
I try to read it before he does the PBS NewsHour to see if he's going to make a reference during his conversation on the NewsHour. Um,
yeah.
but uh, Denny, you've read a couple of his books. You've passed those ideas along
Yes.
to me. Yeah.
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 He's always been, much more thoughtful and looking at a broader kind of macro take on the current environment than,
Right.
a lot of commentators who are so focused on, the moment.
Hmm. Yeah. He certainly takes the 35,000 foot view.
And
Historically.
he
Yeah, go ahead.
speaks on PBS, I think, on Friday,
Right.
right, at
Yes.
5:30.
Yeah.
Yeah, not
Um,
PBS, but maybe Lester Holt.
the news hour, isn't it?
The News
Yeah.
Hour.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's PBS.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but I miss him. You remember Mark Shields? Brooks and
Yes.
Oh,
Shields.
yes,
Oh,
They
of
used
yeah.
to
course.
be such good foils for each other. I
Yeah.
don't
No, it's
I
Brooks and
haven't
Capehart.
Yeah. And they're
Yeah.
both really good,
Are they? Yeah,
I think.
I've not watched the news hour for quite some time, so um sadly, because it's probably the best news that we have out there that is in danger of being defunded. But I hear that uh, the administration is starting to back off from that because you can't defund a private corporation, you know. So anyway, um, well, anyway, yeah, I really like the way that really align nicely with what we're reading about this idea of paganism, which is the context out of which Christianity grows. And what we're beginning to see is that, in the chapter we're just finishing with Pagels, the development of Christianity, and in particularly the rhetoric of Christianity, and by rhetoric I mean, the arguments made for and against something you would expect to see in a, like in a courthouse, in a trial, where you're laying out an argument. That really comes out of a lot of it is informed by pagan philosophy and the structure of pagan philosophy. And I think the last part of this chapter is really good in that respect, and that she tries to demonstrate that. But the whole focus of this chapter, of course, is on, I'm already on another chapter in my book here, but the idea of Israel. And when we met last time, we were just talking about, she's roughly looking at the historical progression or regression, depending on your point of view, that goes from, the time of Jesus to Paul, or I really shouldn't say the time of Jesus. It really goes from, Paul to the Gospels and to some of the early church fathers, all the way up to the time of, Augustine, well, Constantine, then Augustine. So it's really from the 1st to the 5th century. And the development that she's looking at in chapter 1 is the way that the church really wrested from the Jews, understood as themselves to be the chosen people, this idea that the church itself was a new Israel. And in order to make that argument, they had to compare themselves in a positive way over against the so-called old Israel. And in so doing, we established some of our, unfortunately, some of our stereotypes of Judaism. But at first, it starts out as what she refers to as an intra-Jewish argument, that the church itself was predominantly Jewish, and in the synagogues, people were arguing about whether or not Jesus was the Messiah. Some said yes, some said no. But eventually that split takes place. And it looks as if the Gospels that we know, especially Matthew, Luke, and John, were written about the time that followers of Jesus in the synagogues were starting to break away from the more traditional Jews in the synagogue. And we see, some of this intra-Jewish conflict in the Gospel of John, and which, Mac correctly pointed out that, I think I said last time that the Gospel of John has been seen as being, anti-Semitic. I mean, it has been interpreted that way, but we have already seen in our study in the past that this was a document. This was a gospel that was written not with the intent of, speaking out against the entire Jewish nation, but there certainly was an intra-Jewish conversation going on that pitted more traditional Jews against the followers of Jesus. But it's not long, and especially until, when the Gentile population of the church begins to take over, that the separation between Jewish followers of Jesus and Gentile followers of Jesus, and sometimes churches were mixed with the two, becomes more and more distinct. And we start to see rhetoric that refers to the Jews as, let's say, a forgotten people, refers to the Jews as those who had somehow forsaken the covenant, if they ever had it in the first place. And the true Israel is to be the church. And so that sets up a really difficult argument, because there are places, in the Old Testament, people are still reading the Old Testament, that talk about, the Jews being the chosen people, those who, have been accepted by God, to be the bearers of the covenant, But as we move later into the centuries, we start to see people like Augustine, and this is where we left off last time. Augustine starting to make a distinction between what we might call what he calls the Israel according to the flesh, which are the Jews, right? And then Israel according to the Spirit. Somehow the church, the body of Christ, has become the new spiritual Israel over against, the Jews, who are interpreted increasingly as people who are, obsessed with their sacrifices, obsessed with their lack of true knowledge of God. And by the time of Augustine, we see that separation clearly taking place. So this is where we left off last time, and with this quote: "The Jews indeed," Augustine says, "had been scattered with the temple's destruction in 70 CE." Now, what he's referring to here is a reference in the Psalms that says something along the lines of, "Lest let your people be scattered, lest they forget your law." So, if God really wanted the Jews to be left behind, then what is this, psalm referring to? The psalm seems to be referring to the importance of, even in the scattering of the Jewish people, there is a reason, a purpose in that, lest they forget the law. And Augustine's opponent, a man by the name of Paulinus, is making this argument. Look, God hasn't forgotten the Jews. In fact, the scattering that happens after the fall of the temple in 70, and then even later after the Bar Kokhba revolution in rebellion in 135, there's a purpose in that, and God is still, holding fast to his covenant with God's people. But Augustine says, I don't think so. I think what has happened here is we have a kind of a two-tier system. And so the Jews, says Augustine, had been scattered with the temple's destruction in 70 of the Common Era, but the scattering had been to the benefit of the church. So now the reason they were scattered is so that the church could progress. This is Augustine's view. The prestigious antiquity of their books, their continuing attachment to them, all served to convince pagans of the gospel's truth. That was the utility of the Jews not forgetting their law. As for Paul's statement on the redemption of all Israel, Paul says that in Romans, right? And all Israel will be saved. And here's the important point: that cannot refer to Israel secundum carnem, or Israel according to the flesh, the Jews themselves, but it only refers to Israel secundum spiritum, Israel according to the Spirit, which is the church. The church is the spiritual new Israel. The church is the fulfillment of the covenant that was originally given to the Jews, according to some commentators, or was given to the Jews and they broke the covenant. Now it's given anew to the church itself. But you now have this distinction between spirit, Christianity, we call it that now in the 2nd century, and the flesh. A dichotomy, a dualism that really fits into the Greco-Roman world quite nicely, because as we will see when we look at Platonic philosophy here, there is a kind of not a qualitative dualism, but certainly flesh is less has less of a divine quality than spirit. Let's put it that way. So any comments about that so far?
Dan,
Yeah.
is it fair to say that the distinction between the Hebrew Bible as an expression and the Old Testament is reflected in this redefinition of the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, interesting. Can you if I'm hearing your nuance correctly, it's for the longest time we have used the terminology Old Testament. And the idea of Old Testament comes out of this type of conflict, right? That's the old, that's no longer as relevant. And that's what we're going to get into right now, this idea of what's called supersessionism. And the church has never held to this idea, but supersessionism is the idea that somehow Christianity has superseded Judaism and Judaism's no longer relevant. That tends to be supported by the name Old Testament, right? It's old and it's in the way, it's past, In recent years, really in the 20th century, scholars, because of their recognition that the history of relations between Jews and Christians has been so fraught, have started to refer to the Old Testament as the Hebrew Bible. In other words, giving credence to the idea that this was the first covenant. In fact, if you've ever heard Damon read from the so-called Old Testament, what does he call it? Do you remember? The First Testament. And in other words, affirming that this is in alignment with the theology of the Christian theology of the church. The suggestion of old has this qualitative nuance to it that it's passé, in the past, and somehow Christianity has jumped in and superseded that old way of looking at things. And that's what we want to get away from, especially in post-Holocaust, in our post-Holocaust world. Anyway, go ahead, Denny. I knew you wanted to say something. I cut you off.
No, that's fine. I really appreciate what she has done here in terms of how, you know, the 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 thinkers in the proto-Christian church, um, from the um, Gospel of John to Constantine,
Mhm.
um, have done what you're talking about, and that is done a lot of picking and choosing of, you know, Isaiah maybe and some of the
Yeah.
other prophetic voices and maybe Psalms, and
Mhm.
left the early uh, what would you call it, Deuteronomic, uh,
Well,
Leviticus,
yeah,
the
the
laws,
Pentateuchal, yeah,
yeah, yes, left that, on the shelf.
yeah. And you can imagine, you can see why, because look at what Paul said, look at the Reformation, especially when Paul talks about, that we're no longer saved by the law, but saved by grace. And this is what Paul tries to explain in Romans chapters 9 through 11, So what purpose is there for the law? And theologians throughout the centuries have tried to figure this out. Okay, well, if we're saved by grace and not by the law, then is the law obsolete? Then do we even need the law anymore? And people like Luther and Calvin have made their arguments for retaining the law, but not as a means for salvation, but as a moral guide for, being truly human. but but it's still by grace, not by all the ways that you follow the Ten Commandments or the 614 other uh, regulations. It's not a result of you following those regulations so well that brings you salvation. So you can even see that Paul kind of sets the stage uh, in his letter to the Romans, like it's not by works of the law that we're saved, but by grace. Well, then that begs the question, well, then why do we even need the law at all? And there are various answers to those that I won't go into because I don't think I can remember them quite as well as I need to right now. But Luther was very, was very articulate about this. The law serves as kind of a foundation for civic society, for example. Just like the Babylonian law that preceded it. It was the first way to try to recognize the common rights or the common humanity that we all share, and how we should observe that in a certain way. The Code of Hammurabi is what I'm referring to there. But it doesn't have a spiritual significance of being the arbiter between us and our salvation, offered by God. That is not what reformers want to say, but it is still valuable in its own way. But you can see how, it's very easy to see Judaism as something that has been superseded. And there are still Christians today that I know, I mean, that will make this argument, whether they believe they're making it or not. So, any other comments about that? Will, did I see you wanting to say something, or? No. All right.
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Danny,
so the-
please.
the text of the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible are identical?
Oh, this is a fascinating question. Yes, I mean, for all intents and purposes, when we say the Hebrew Bible, we're referring to what had formerly been called the Old Testament. It's almost like when we say, 1972 of the Common Era is what we used to say, 1972 Anno Domini, right? There was a certain value statement that came inherent with AD that we believe that we have dispelled when we talk about the Common Era. Same thing with the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament / the Hebrew Bible. Now, the reason I think your question is interesting is because as a Protestant, I can say, yeah, they're identical, except when you read the so-called Old Testament in the Catholic Church, there is something called the intertestamental literature, or the Apocrypha, that is recognized as inspired by Catholics, but not divinely inspired by Protestants. And that I could go on for about 10 more minutes if you'd like to hear, but we can talk about this at some other time. But really, it harkens back to the idea that the Protestant Bible is based on the original Hebrew Bible, and not the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was translated in this, I think it was, well, somewhere between the 2nd century, and the intertestamental literature was written somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 AD. And Catholics include that because it was originally included in the Greek Old Testament. But the reformers, because they were humanists and they wanted to read the original Hebrew language, they went to the Hebrew Bible, which did not include these extra books from the Apocrypha. I hope that's not too confusing, but I find it really fascinating, because when people say, well, I believe in the Bible, and you just have to say, well, what Bible are you talking about? The Catholic Bible or the Protestant Bible? Because they're not the same, right? Anyway, I want to finish up on chapter 1 here, just to kind of show where Fredrickson is going with this, because it's going to be pretty much foundational for where she goes in the rest of this book. But we now have this distinction between what she calls rhetorical Jews, and that is Jews that Christians have defined for the Christians' own purposes, right? And then historical Jews who were living, in the historical context, who were being defined now by Christians. So she's making that distinction. Jews that are rhetorical are Jews that are being used for philosophical purposes and for apologetic purposes by Christian apologists to try to explain how Christianity has superseded Judaism. Their interpretation, however, does not entirely match up with what's being practiced by the Jews of history. And I hope that's the case, because one of them is a rhetorical argument, explaining people for your own purposes, to try to win an argument. The other has, kind of a boots on the ground reality. For example, there was, even beginning in the first century, an epistle by Barnabas, so the Epistle of Barnabas, which is not included in the Bible, of course, but is one of these early, texts that were written very close to the source. And Barnabas is making the argument that the Jews have been superseded. And I'll just read it. I'm on page 24. Let me just see. The Christian critique of Jewish blood sacrifices. This goes around the idea. This is part of the issue here. Christians do not feel that a blood sacrifice is necessary anymore, because Jesus was the final sacrifice, right? But somehow, when they're arguing in the 2nd century, they are pulling out this image of past Judaism and applying it to their contemporary Jews. It was Jews of the past who sacrificed at the temple. But now the temple is gone, right? So when Barnabas is writing in the early 2nd century, there's no temple. There is no blood sacrifice, but nevertheless, he's going to draw on an old image of Judaism to try to make his point that Christianity has superseded that. So, Christian critique of Jewish blood sacrifice, whereby Gentile writers use Jewish scriptures to criticize and to repudiate a defunct Jewish practice. The Epistle of Barnabas, a pseudonymous 2nd century sermon, inveighed heatedly against blood offerings. Now remember, in the 2nd century, Jews nowhere were sacrificing. Sacrifices could only take place in the temple. There was no temple. There were only synagogues. People don't sacrifice in synagogues. It's anathema, right? But Barnabas nevertheless kind of overlooks that historical Jewish practice at the time. According to the author, Israel had never received the true covenant at all. Moses, in his fury at Israel's idolatrous adoration of the golden calf, had shattered it. So in other words, Moses comes down and he had the true covenant. When they saw the people being idolatrous, the covenant was broken and was never picked up again by the people. They blew it right from the start. Christ is the uniquely effective blood offering, says Barnabas. Food laws are not about food, but expressions of ethical allegories. Do not eat swine, censors wallowing in luxury. Do not eat hare, warns against sexual profligacy. Do not eat hyena. These are all out of, Deuteronomy. Condemns adultery. But you see what's happening is that you're taking very literal interpretations and you're spiritualizing them, right? Because the true Israel is the spiritual Israel of the church. Circumcision is about the heart. This is right out of Paul, not about body parts. It used to be a member of the true Israel, you had to be circumcised as a male. Paul put an end to that, right? Circumcision of the heart, a kind of a spiritual conversion must take place. The temple's destruction, and here's the final nail in the coffin, the temple's destruction proved what is evident from a right reading of scripture. God had never wanted blood sacrifices anyway, as is obvious to anyone with spiritual understanding. The true temple is the community of right believers. So by the 2nd century, you've got arguments being made along these lines. The true temple is the church, right? Same thing is going to be argued by Tertullian, just a little bit later on, that Jews are obsessed with sacrifice, and in their focus on this fleshly world and blood sacrifice, they completely obscure the spiritual reality of God. And because of this, God destroyed the temple in 70 of the Common Era. It was so that he could, I never wanted sacrifice in the first place. And actually, there is some support for this in Amos, the prophet Amos, for example, and the other prophets. I don't want your solemn festivals, says God. But the irony in all of this is that the rhetoric being used against the Jews is coming out of pagan philosophical rhetorical devices. You're setting up a straw man to tear him down, right? And this, we still see this in the practice of law and, in the court. You hyperbolize the, your opponent, and you speak in the most extreme terms, and to the point where you're setting up a counter example to your argument. And then after you've shown how bad, your opponent is, you're going to demonstrate how good and how right your position is. And this is, Cicero, right? This is right out of the rhetoric of the Greco-Roman period. So this rhetoric will be used by Christians to argue for the appropriation of this term, we are the chosen people. The church, the true Israel, the spiritual Israel, is the chosen one, the one who was, expected all along by God. And thus the church supersedes Judaism. And I left this, I put this picture on here because this whole idea of sacrifice is still present in the minds of the ultra-Orthodox, who, are very literalistic about their understanding and their interpretation of Scripture. Not just what we call the Old Testament, not just the Torah and the law, but, the Mishnah and the Talmud and all of the rabbinical teachings thereafter. But they believe in order for Israel to truly be Israel, temple sacrifice has to take place. So in every day, every year at Passover, the ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem go about symbolically the task of reminding people that they are wanting the temple to be rebuilt and reestablished so sacrifice can take place. And so they walk through the streets of Israel, carrying this goat ostensibly to go up onto the Temple Mount, or at least to the Wailing Wall, and to sacrifice it there. And they've been arrested as a result of this. But there still is this, this sense among some Jews that in order to truly be Jewish, you have to engage in sacrifice, because that's what the law says. Christians for 2,000 years have seen this as being barbaric. And to be quite frank, I mean, most Jews today do not acknowledge this, but the ultra-Orthodox do. The conservative and the Reformed Jews do not, or the Reconstruction Jews do not. But, there's still a vestige of this old image that remains with us. Any questions about that?
So, Dan, no sacrifices in the synagogue before the destruction of the temple, only in the.
Oh, that's correct. Yeah. The synagogue was a place where, okay, and it all goes back to Babylonian captivity, as so many things do. But, when the Jews were in Babylon and their temple was destroyed the first time, they could not, and this was 587 to 539 BCE, they were prohibited from sacrificing, from practicing, their religion, because, you had to sacrifice to the king, the Babylonian king. We see this in the book of Daniel, right? That Daniel and his brothers and refused to sacrifice or refused to bow down to the king. So what they did is they reinterpreted the idea of sacrifice to be much like Paul, to sacrifice your will. Reading the Torah, which is the altar, sacrificing your will on the altar of the Torah so that you are following God's commands. That is a true and vital sacrifice. That was taken back from the Babylonian captivity when the Jews returned to Jerusalem. And there was a split that took place among Jews. One fork in the road said, we know, we're doing quite well, thank you very much, in Babylon, and we were developing a new understanding of God. And the whole temple sacrifice thing just doesn't seem to be really important. But there were others who were saying, oh, no, because, it's very clear that there are all of these prescriptions in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy for, how to build the tent of meeting and how to sacrifice and how to prepare the priest and everything. And so even by 539, there was this conflict among Jews who had returned from Babylon. One aspect of that fork in the road was going to lead eventually to a more progressive Hellenistic Judaism, of which Jesus was a part, a more progressive understanding of sacrifice. And the other was going to, maintain its very, very conservative, reactionary, no, we have to do it the way we've always done. If I can carry that all the way up to the present century, the fork in the road that leads through Jesus and, really Paul for that matter, is going to lead to the more reform, I don't know if conservative is kind of, but let's say reform and more progressive type of Judaism. The other fork in the road is going to lead to the ultra-Orthodox who want to say, no, we need a temple, we need a temple, we need a temple. This is in many ways at the heart of the conflict that we see going on, is an aspect, I should say, I don't want to be so bold, but it is an aspect of the conflict that we see going on in Jerusalem and Israel/Palestine, Palestine/Israel right now. Does that answer your question, Denny?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, that whole Second Temple period is fascinating, and so, and we've discussed it when reading other books as well. Other comments about this? Will, Sharon, Lynn, Harvey? Harvey leave us? No, he's with us. There he is. Well, any comments about chapter 1? That brings us to right at the conclusion of chapter 1, and here's Fredrickson's conclusion. She's going to take us from the 1st century all the way up to the end of the 5th century, and in each of these chapters looking at a particular theme. And she concludes this theme on the idea of Israel in this way. As the empire ages in the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, as bishops become increasingly empowered, as their urban base becomes increasingly radicalized and codes and councils strain to regulate acceptable Roman religion, Jews will be increasingly lumped together with pagans and heretics, two other groups that demarcated the limits of religious respectability. Christian Roman law will demote Jewish ancestral tradition to a superstition, and and this was from the Theodosian Code, to a perversity alien to the Roman Empire. And that code was written, I believe, in the 5th century, under the Emperor Theodosius. But, and which is pretty much laying it out that Jews are not seen as legitimate. They're superstitious, and therefore as potential enemies to the state. Now, the irony of this is that for some reason, and this is mysterious in this way, Judaism is still never outlawed. And I'll read the last paragraph on page 29. Yet there was a difference. In the rhetoric of Roman law, heretics were denounced as insane, false Christians, pagans as clear outsiders. So Jews appear to fall under this designation. The legal rhetoric itself sought to establish clear and stable boundaries between the groups. But unlike paganism and heresy, and despite certain legal disabilities, Judaism itself was never forbidden. The others were. Judaism itself was never forbidden. Legally, socially, religiously, Jews within a now Christian society retained an ambiguous status and experienced an unstable and inconstant tolerance, one that would follow them into the Middle Ages and beyond. That's very profound, really. That would follow them into the Middle Ages and beyond. And they would swing back and forth between the extremes of being accepted, but outsiders nevertheless, or being completely heretical and sought out and killed. The pendulum would swing throughout Western history on how Jews would be treated. So there we have it. I shouldn't laugh. It's a sad history, unfortunately. So, well, I think I'm just going to give you just a very brief introduction to chapter 2, but I'm going to read it from Fredrickson herself, because what she's done in each of these chapters is given us a little, a preamble or a epigraph, you might say, on how it, on what she's going to discuss. But this follows from the previous chapter. And it also is very relevant to us right now, because it talks about the dilemmas of diversity. And I think she would just as equally have, described this as the threat of diversity. And you should be hearing DEI and you're ringing in your ears right now, right? Because diversity in the minds of many, especially in the minds of the pagan, narcissistic male who needs to be in control, diversity is a threat. In the minds of those who have a sense of the shared humanity of others, diversity is an opportunity for creative engagement, for what Whitehead referred to as intensity and contrast of experience. Yesterday Cinco de Mayo? No, it was Monday. People were pointing out the irony of all these people, all the MAGA folks, wanting to celebrate Cinco de Mayo when in fact they should have no business doing so, because it's they ultimately don't want to celebrate diversity, in the legal and the justice system. But hey, when it comes time to drink some tequila and everything, well, we're all about that, right? So, but diversity, and this harkens back, not just to Plato, but all the way to the idea of the Upanishads. What in Hinduism, or in India, at what point does diversity in a culture or diversity in metaphysical reality become chaos? And at what point does unity become stasis and stifling? Many people like to err on the side of unity, regardless of, despite the fact that it becomes static and stifling, right? Because we know what to expect. We can control what we can expect. We don't want any surprises. That's what comes with diversity, right? Others who want to, the anarchists, for example, who want to err on the side of diversity, run the risk of having their whole system descend into chaos. So how do we balance these things? This is the question that you find in the Upanishads. You find this in Plato, for example, who, by the way, erred on the side of unity in his Republic. Plato basically wrote the autocrat's manual for the rest of history, because Plato's Republic basically says, no, we exile. Tell me how familiar this sounds. We exile all the kids over 12 years, all the people over 12 years old. We allow the philosopher kings to bring them up in the way of a unified theory of thinking, right? And therefore, and we identify those who are exceptional and can stay with the system, and those who are going to be workers who don't have the mental capacity. And then we create a world, a utopian world that is ruled by the philosopher kings, and highly controlled, but controlled in a good way, because the philosopher kings have an insight into the truth and to reality, right? Man, you can't get more authoritarian than that. Thank you very much, Plato. And we could argue that democracy, democracy as we know it, was the 2,500 year response, or 2,400 year response to Plato's Republic. People wanting to recognize the importance of diversity and the importance of individuals who have rights and who can exercise those rights in their own creative and free and in their own creative way and freedom. Don't get me started, because this this question has confounded me from the time of graduate school. So I could really start getting pretty energetic here. But let's just read what Fredrickson has to say, and then we'll pick up with our time next week. I'd really like to introduce you to something called Neoplatonism, because it's going to be really important from about the 3rd century of the Common Era. It's a Greek philosophy from the 3rd century of the Common Era onward. But Fredrickson gives us a very short introduction to it, but I want to give you a little broader introduction, I'd say. But I'll conclude with this epigraph, okay? From the earliest sources we have Paul's letters and the later Gospels. The message of salvation in Christ was clearly interpreted in a variety of ways. That's a theme that runs throughout the book, obviously. This very variety became a source of bitter internal arguments. Later Gentile Christianities also produced many different interpretations of the Christian message. Its spokesman condemned diversity as deviance, as heresy. Once imperial politics with Constantine came into play, charges of heresy had serious social consequences. Heretics were considered a danger not only to the church, but also to the state. Not lasso, but also. I'll change that next time. So you see now how church and state become one, and therefore heresy and treason become one as well. That's precisely, in my opinion, what we see happening with this move towards Christian nationalism. So, any comments about this before we move on till next week?
Well, there seems to be a movement toward not wanting to have split allegiances, which of course we're still looking at on a global level now. It used to be the divine
Absolutely.
right of kings, the divine right of rulers. And
Yeah,
if they came
sure.
together once in a while and anointed one another, that was a while. But we keep going back and forth on that, right?
Yeah, because the pendulum keeps swinging from, extreme authoritarianism to, towards sliding into anarchy, right? And sometimes, but I think in the 250 years that democracy, in my opinion, In the 250 years that democracy has prevailed in the West, in the United States and France and Germany, and well, for the most part, uh, I think I personally am very committed to the idea that this is the height of human social philosophy, that it allows for a kind of unity that does not completely stifle diversity. It allows for the the expression of individual rights, but it also demands, in some respects, responsibility, because that's another swing, rights versus responsibility. Anyway, we could talk forever. I'm sure you could, Denny, and all of you, but especially Denny's done politics and anthropology. Anybody want to have the final word before we move on?
Oh, I think the universality of the scapegoat, first introduced, I think, in the Hebrew Bible, is so clear here. You've got to show, like advertising Wheaties and Fruit Loops, the difference. And you've got to somewhere or another, you've got to put down the other.
Yeah, right, exactly. And boy, I want to go off on a tangent here, but but at some point, and I've mentioned this person before, Rene Girard, who was an anthropologist who recently died in the last 10 years, but his whole actually he was a literary critic, but his study of literary criticism saw throughout the narratives of history, it doesn't matter where it was, the world over, what he calls mimetic theory and the idea of the scapegoat as being essential to human organization. And his argument is that Christianity was the first narrative that demonstrated that killing the scapegoat did not produce the desired effect of peace, but only perpetuated more violence. So for the first time in history, Christianity provided a narrative that told the story from the scapegoat's perspective, not from the perspective of those in power who were, trying to promote mimetic theory or trying to promote the importance of killing a scapegoat or otherizing a scapegoat. Anyway, that's really interesting stuff, in my opinion. I have to admit, I know the stuff I'm interested in is just not on anybody's radar sometimes, but anyway, I can at least share my enthusiasm. So, all right. We're gonna read about the first 20 pages of chapter 2 for next time. And I hope you all are still enjoying the book, because it's not easy. It's not it's not Spong. But it's nevertheless it's cutting edge stuff. We're right at the cutting edge of theological and historical critique with this book. So I am going to stop the share here, and not that that is ever a good thing to do, but in this case, it's going to be necessary. And I'll see you next Wednesday.